Hello, this is a narration of a tiger that I painted. I don't know whether you could have guessed that. This is right at the start of the painting process. This is using Infinite Painter to start things off. As you can see, everything is already blocked in a very rough kind of level. And just introducing the contrast, which is quite key with the tiger, especially with all the different patterns on its coat. And yes, building it up. As you can see, I've got some very white whites and some very black blacks, but I think for this, that would really work well for something like this. And I want to make the background quite interesting as well, if I can do. And I had an idea maybe to blur the background a bit. Just getting everything in place, getting the idea there. Starting to set the lighting up a bit more as well to add a bit more interest. Smoothing things around, adding in detail. Playing around with a lot of brushes at this point in Infinite Painter. I was really looking to use some form of palette knife, and they do have a section where you can blur things out, move paint around. So I was playing around with those brushes a little bit and trying to pull these shapes around to get the added detail, which is something I typically use in ArtRage with the palette knife. And as you can see there, with all I wanted to get a sense of all the fur as well, but I didn't want to paint in every single strand. My idea was to take the blocks of colour that I had and using like a smudge tool just to smudge things around slightly so that they overlap all the dark stripes on the tiger to give that effect of fur. Now I've imported into ArtRage. First thing that I'm doing is I have created a layer here, which is going to be a multiply layer, and set it to bright white. Set my oil brush to not stiff in any shape or form and to have no thinners. So therefore, when I'm painting over it in multiply, you just see the brush strokes. Because I don't really get that effect in Infinite Painter, and I haven't quite worked it out yet. And of course, ArtRage is very much for the traditional look. And here I do this as well sometimes. Originally I went round, as you can see here, I have now changed the layer to normal, and therefore it all comes up a bright white. And this is just to show if there's any places that I've missed regarding my paint coverage. And I'm just filling up all the gaps and then toggling it back to multiply. And then just kind of figuring out what I want to do with it. I just need to refine this painting a bit. And I'm not really happy with the background at the moment. It doesn't quite fit in. I almost have an idea of something blurry, but also something interesting. Here I'm using the palette knife, which was the thing that I was trying to get Infinite Painter to do, but I couldn't quite get the right feel for it. This blur palette knife is one of my favourite ones, which pulls things around, it pulls your paint around. Typically I use the settings about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way. That seems to give a really good pull in the fact you can pull some paint from one place to another and it would just taper very slightly and almost run out rather than pulling it all the way through. And I find that gives me a combination of sharp lines, which is always a good thing to have, but also it does a tiny bit of blending as well. It's the best of both worlds. Now for the background, I wanted to make it look more painterly. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the tube of paint and playing around with a couple of colours and just splattering it all on the background. And then what I'll do is I'll use the palette knife and move it all around and just see what effect I get. It's quite a good method for creating clouds and things typically, but I thought it might work because I'll have all the blending of the colours everywhere and it will blur things out slightly as well. As you can see here, I'm using the blur The preset I'm using here is one that I created myself, which was a cloudy one, which gives you some really extreme types of palette knife effects. And as you can see there, I gave it a couple of goes, didn't really like it, so I undid it, and then so it was and again, this is digital painting. I experimented a little bit, which is a great thing that you can do with this. If I was doing this normally, I'm not sure what I'd do, because there would be so much paint going on in the background. And as you can see there's little lines, and this was due to when I split the foreground and the background. It doesn't always, what I tend to do is I tend to draw around the foreground, then cut it and then paste it. But when you paste it, sometimes there's a little kind of line that's left. So I'm going round through with a palette knife and just getting rid of it by emphasizing all the fur. So I'm taking the edges of the tiger and just pulling the paint out towards the edges so that they look more furry. And this is where ArtRage comes into its own with animal portraits, because of course you don't want to be doing all the fur at all. You want to just give inference that fur is there, and the palette knife and pulling paint around does the perfect job for all those kind of things. As you can see there, what I'm doing here is I'm separating out the foreground and the background again. Now what I wanted to do, and what I always like to do, is I like to have the background as a full layer but with full colour on it. Now because I took it from Infinite Painter, it meant that when I cut the foreground out, it gave the background with this big hole in it, but I don't really like that. So what I'm doing now is I'm using the clone tool to just fill in the gaps. It doesn't really matter what's in there, because it will be obscured by the layer above of the tiger, but just for my own sanity I really like to do that, and the clone tool is really good for things like that. So I'm just going over and just filling it roughly in. And so what I really now have is I have a foreground of the tiger and then a full image, full colour, full texture background, which I can work with, which I always like to have. As you can see there, I don't know whether you noticed, but I just played around with the contrast because I wasn't too happy with it. There we go. See, just there to there. Just improve the contrast very slightly, and the saturation as well. I think it just helps to make, and you can do this in ArtRage. They have a filter section where you can set the saturation level and you can set the contrast. And of course the next step is to emphasize the eyes as much as I can do, but I am always very wary of where the light's coming from. The light's coming from the right hand side and therefore will make contact with this eye here, so that's going to be fairly bright. And now because the eyes are in a portrait almost one of the most important things, you can get very carried away with doing both eyes and just putting on here. I'll have either an overlay layer or maybe a color dodge if I'm extra extravagant, and then going through and let's just slap some on here. But of course this eye is all in darkness, well, not darkness, but it's not getting as much light as this eye here. And if you do slap a whole load of color dodge on it, it just won't look right. It will just look really off. So it's almost, sometimes it's better just to, either be very subtle with that eye that's in shadow, or just leave it completely alone and focus on this one. Even though you may be tempted so much to focus on this other eye and just to add a splash of saturated colour, most of the time less is more, and it's not really worth doing. Let's carry on, and that was pretty much it. So it's quite loose, this one overall, and the overall effect was really just to get something that just was simple and just gave the effect of the fur on the tiger. Okay, thank you very much for watching.